We will start out by acknowledging that those at our Trothida campus in Fairbanks are on the unceded customary lands of the Dinaw people of the Tanana River. In Nome, we are on Inupiaq, Yupik, and Siberian Yupik lands. We honor the continued fight for the rights of First Peoples and stand together in solidarity and action. At UAF, we're growing into a socially just and caring institution of higher education. This ongoing speaker series, titled Shine a Light, promoting conversations on diversity, equity, and inclusion, is designed to encourage understanding, build empathy, and engage us in thinking critically about our worldviews. The series is led by UAF's Northwest Campus, but like all great diversity efforts, there are many partnerships and collaborations. We thank the UAF Department of Equity and Compliance and UAF's Nanook Diversity and Action Center for teaming up with the Northwest Campus to bring this series to reality. You can find the recordings of past presentations on the Northwest Campus's website under the Courses tab. This link will be provided to you in the chat. This semester, our Shine a Light events are during the noon hour of each third Tuesday of the month. Again, thank you for being here for today's event, and we hope you continue to join us. I would like to acknowledge that today's presentation is a heavy topic that may impact listeners in different ways. Please, if you're struggling, reach out to others. We will be sharing several resources in the chat as well as within today's presentation. I would now like to introduce and thank our speaker, Charlene Akpic-Apak, for today's presentation on this important topic titled Data for Indigenous Justice, addressing missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people in Alaska. Charlene is a Inupiaq with family from White Mountain and Gullivan and has served in many spaces as an advocate for Indigenous women, Indigenous sovereignty, climate justice, and Indigenous rights to health and well-being. Please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions that Charlene may address at the end of her presentation. You're more than welcome to use the chat feature, but please be sure to put your questions in the Q&A so we don't miss them. At this time, I'll turn it over to Charlene. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Margot. Thank you, team, and all the organizers. And it's an honor. I'm actually alumni, so I did my graduate degrees at UAF. So I love being able to share back and update with what I've been doing since going to school. I'm going to share my screen to have some photos for giving myself an introduction as well. So there we go. So Vanga Charlene Apak Anubak Siska Akpik, Chinik Mugarunga Sulina Chirvik Mugarunga Akaga Sandra Baby Lu Apak, Naga Evan Luklan, Savaktunga Native Movement Me Suli, Data for Indigenous Justice Me. So my name is Charlene Apak. My Inupiaq name is Akpik, and I use she, they pronouns. My family is from Gullivan and White Mountain, and I, of course, have lots of family in Nome as well. My mother, Sandra Baby Lu Apak, and I have a son, Evan Luklan. And I currently reside on Dena'ina territories here in Anchorage, Alaska. And again, thank you so much for having me. And I'm going to make sure that we have time at the end for questions and answers. So I'll go through my presentation and please put them there, and we'll do those at the end, and I'll do my best to answer them. But thank you again for having me and letting me share today. So before we get started, I do want to recognize, although, we'll be talking about, I'll be sharing specifically about data. We know that this is the stories of our lives, it's the story of our people, and it's the stories of loved ones who are very, very much so missed. And so although I'll be again talking about data and different things like that, we know that these are very real stories and hurts that we have. And I appreciate the resources that were shared in the chat. And again, if you need to pause or, step away or anything like that, I encourage that. But I'll be doing my very, very best, as I always do, to do this in a sensitive and considerate way, knowing that these are our loved ones. I wanted to take that moment to acknowledge that. I also wanted to share, although I'm the only one speaking today, I'm always surrounded and I'm really grateful for incredible leadership and mentorship. Data for Indigenous Justice is a nonprofit that's homed here in Alaska. So we home and steward the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls database for the state here in Alaska. And this is the board of my nonprofit. So Jody Potts is from the interior, from the native village of Eagle, and has a long history of advocacy for our people, particularly women, and has worked in law enforcement. Abigail Echohawk was raised in Alaska. She currently resides in Washington, but she's done a ton of work in research and advocacy for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls from the lower 48, and is currently at the Urban Indian Health Institute. And then Malia Villegas is currently serves her Afognak tribe, but she has a background in policy. Dr. Malia Villegas, sorry, has a background in policy and was previously the director at NCAI, the National Congress of American Indians. And so this board is just really fantastic, has really incredible backgrounds and expertise that guide me. And so I just want to share that when I do this work, it's with so many other people. And that's important to acknowledge them and all they contribute. I also just wanted to share our, this is a lot of words on a slide, but I wanted to share our purpose, and really it's decolonizing data. And what does that mean? And so as we track and home the database on this important topic for our state, we do it with a lot of care and values of protection and benefit that haven't always been the case of Alaska Native people engaging with research in the Western paradigm. So the way that we do this work is very different and transformative. And one of the reasons we do this is because we can turn around and take care of this data and advocate for our people and get it into the hands of our people to do this work. And so I just wanted to share the purpose of which we were founded to do this work. And I also want to recognize again partners. And so Data for Indigenous Justice is one organization that's part of a working group. So there's an MMIWG2S, which stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and Two-Spirited Peoples Alaska Working Group. And you can find them on Facebook. But it's this partnership across these orgs: the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, the Alaska Native Heritage Center, Native Peoples Action, the Alaska Native Justice Center, Native Movement, and Data for Indigenous Justice all work together. We're all statewide Indigenous-led orgs that do this work. Every week we meet for 2 hours. So people who are really dedicated to doing this. And so we bring many skill sets together to address this issue. And again, I'm just going to be sharing pretty specifically about the data, but I'm happy to answer questions about the working group or some of the other things we have going on. If this topic is new to you, just a brief overview. This is not just a crisis here in Alaska, it's a nationwide crisis. It's also an international crisis. We see this happening in Canada, in other countries, but coming together has been so important, and having more awareness around this issue, because then we're able to say, this didn't just happen to me and my family. Hey, look, it's happening to others. And this is a systemic issue that is rooted in colonization. And so we work together across not just the state, but in the lower 48, and know that this is happening, and we stand in solidarity with all the other groups who are doing this important work. Some people often ask, well, what is the problem? And it's really complex, to be honest. And at the same time, it's complex, but it's also all rooted in colonization. But some of the issues are that this is a systemic issue, which means it's built into systems. So you can't just take care of one thing. We can't just work on data alone, but we need data is just one of the pieces. So there's lack of protections for Indigenous people, particularly femme identifying people, so women and two-spirited folks. When we're missing in data, as I'll talk more about, it means that we aren't able to always advocate and say, hey, this is what's happening and this is our reality. And so it's been really important to reclaim the data. And we're also missing in media. So oftentimes, and this has been talked about more recently, is that when we have loved ones who go missing, it isn't covered in the news and media. We saw some of the disparities of this that came out of Wyoming recently, if you're familiar with that. But there was, disproportionate amount of coverage in media from what happens to non-Native people and Indigenous peoples. And so there's many factors and ways that we go missing because it's a systemic issue. We are also, because it's a systemic issue and because there's injustice in so many ways that we see this show up, people often ask for the working group, well, what are you doing? What is your strategy? And our strategy is to seek justice on every front. That's why we have that amazing group of organizations who come together and work on many different areas, from policy and legislation to data to community engagement. Right here in these photos, of course, this is pre-COVID, but we bring our community together for healing. So we know that this work needs to be healing centered. And so not only do we come together on policy and data and reports and things like that, but we create spaces of healing for our communities. And some of that has been in these photos here on the left. You'll see we've done resolutions. There's been actually one in Nome. This is the picture from the one in Anchorage. There's been AFN resolutions. We hold vigils together. We do Heartbeat of the Drums. We've done Arts in Action. Here on the right was a beading workshop, those red dress earrings. We've done painting as healing of arts. Whoops. And so we do this from a healing centered place with our community. We know that in order to seek justice on this front and to make the work sustainable, that we have to do it in a good way. The other piece that isn't pictured here, but I can answer questions about or share more if you're interested, is Data for Indigenous Justice is homing a canoe project, a canoe that's dedicated to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. That's in close partnership with the Heritage Center. That's being built in the Heritage Center, and it's being guided by elders. So we have a lot of really beautiful healing work going on, in addition to some of this data research and policy and advocacy work that we do as a work group. But wanted to make sure you all knew, the way that we do this in a strength-based way. So now I'll dive a little bit deeper into some of the data pieces. So I wanted to share a little bit about the origin story of Data for Indigenous Justice. So in 2018, there was a grassroots effort to call attention to this issue in the state of Alaska, to say, hey, this is happening. And when the organizers put that rally together, they wanted to read the names of our loved ones, only to find there was no list. There was no way to pull names. There was no data. There was no tracking. And so with our community, people came forward and shared the names of our missing and murdered loved ones. And that began the database, was us writing it down and people coming forward and trusting us and sharing those stories with us. And here on the left, it looks a little fuzzy and I apologize, but right there is this huge board that was created, particularly of Native movement at the time. And they put the loved ones' names in the list here on this board, and then mapped it out about where our community members were from. And so right there, that's actually the first quote database of what we had here in Alaska. Shortly after that, the Urban Indian Health Institute put out the first nationwide report on this issue. And on the right, you'll see a picture from their report. And at the time in 2018, Alaska had the fourth highest number of cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls with 52. And again, this is sheer number of cases. It wasn't per population or anything like that. And so this was just a few years ago in 2018. And if you work in research, you know that that's like considered pretty recent research, right? And recent information. So that's where we were at with 52 cases just in 2018. And from then, we've been reclaiming data here in Alaska. So that first information was given to me to steward and to take care of and to add on to, and I've been doing that ever since. Methodologically, I'm going to share a little bit about how I do that and what that looks like. And again, I can answer questions because this alone could be like a whole presentation. But one of the ways that we continue to add to the database is through Freedom of Information Act requests, which is this picture. I hope you can see my mouse on the left. And what that means is that there's a Freedom of Information Act where we have rights to public information. So oftentimes I file FOIA requests with the state and the troopers to get this information because it isn't publicly available. So that's one method. I almost always have FOIA requests pending. I also get denied regularly, but that's a work in progress and a whole nother conversation. The other way that we reclaim data is by working with the federal missing persons database called NamUs. We have really good allies over there who make their information available. We've also done a training for our communities, and it's recorded if you all want to see that, of how to input data into the federal database. And so they've been really great to work with. We've also built relationships by proximity. Again, I'm Anchorage based, working with the Anchorage Police Department specifically on cleaning and scrubbing data and then sharing it. And so that has been a really interesting process because my first meeting with them, which is in this picture, I came with over a dozen questions about how they're doing case management of missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. How are they able to pull? What does their data system look like? How are race and ethnicity in the data systems being captured? What does the case status determination look like? What happens if people have, questions about their case? So many things. And they've actually been really open to having these conversations. The chief of police pictured here has since retired, but McCoy here on the right, he's now the chief of police, and we've continued that work. And again, that's a whole nother conversation, but we do that in building relationship. And so that was a really interesting process for us to approach the police department and do that, but we really believed in being our true authentic selves as Indigenous people, and that the values of building relationship will carry us through. The other way that we reclaim data is here. You'll see this picture of Seeking Alaska's Missing with the green ribbon. And that's a social media group. And actually, I didn't share at the beginning, but like many of us who work in this, and like many of you probably joining, that this issue is really near and dear to our hearts. So Samantha Koenig, who this group was formed out of, was my little cousin. And there's just, I'm a daughter to a mother who she was, when my mom passed away, it was deemed suicide, but there are a lot of family members who believe she was murdered. I have an auntie who also went missing and was declared deceased just because they never found her. And of course, my little cousin Samantha. So I just share that because it's just so important to be transparent about where we're at in our work. But for reclaiming data, social media is a really powerful tool. So this group and others, there's a few others that often people, for many complex reasons, might not want to file police reports, but they will share on social media, hey, have you seen this family member? Or they'll tag, or they'll be like, they'll share it there first. And so oftentimes even social media can be one of the most accurate places that we're able to pull data from, right? And so that's an area where we also find and add names that, again, aren't hitting maybe the law enforcement data systems. So the accuracy of data for Indigenous justice is often more accurate than what the state or law enforcement agencies have because of our relationship with the community and being in the community as well. And then just here on the bottom right, we see this very familiar race and ethnicity box, where oftentimes if you're of a mixed heritage, just as one example, you might mark 2 if you're able to, and then it gets pulled into or lumped into this category of mixed heritage, and we lose that designation of Indigenous identity in data systems. We also, there's just so many things to race ethnicity. But the reason I put this on for reclaiming data is that sometimes we're able to go through and identify our loved ones who maybe also were miscategorized or misclassified for race and ethnicity, and then correct that and have that updated in our system. And again, that's a whole nother conversation about different demographic identifiers that we work through. But I wanted to share it just as an example of ways that we might go missing in data and how we're addressing that and how it can be fixed and what we're doing. So what do cases look like across the state? So again, I shared from 2018, and then I shared some of the ways that we reclaim data. And again, like that's a whole nother, there's so much to that I'm happy to share. And then in 2020, Sovereign Bodies Institute, who we work in close partnership, and they were one of the first databases actually in the US. But Sovereign Bodies Institute put out a report in 2020, so just 2 years after Urban Indian Health Institute, and this is what they released. So if you remember, Alaska had 52 cases in 2018. Here in 2020, they had Alaska at 149. So you can see the increase in the number of documented cases very rapidly when Indigenous people begin tracking and decolonizing and stewarding our own data. And is it that we're having an increase in cases, or is it that we're just documenting what's already happening, right? So this increase that you're seeing, I don't, I think is reflective of more the documentation process of what we're actually living and experiencing versus an increase maybe in cases. And then just this year in February of 2021, Data for Indigenous Justice, again, like I said, we've been homing and stewarding the data continuously in those various ways. We put out the first Alaska specific report for our state, and it was called We Are Calling to You. And there's a whole story behind that that's in the report that I can also share if we have time. But We Are Calling to You put out these numbers here. So in February of 2021, Alaska had 229 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in the state of Alaska. 149 of them were as missing status and 80 is as murdered. And again, just from that short amount of time of us reclaiming our data, you can see the huge increases. And although this number is staggering and tragic and hard, we also know that this is, quote, just the tip of the iceberg because of factors related to data systems, which I'm gonna share a little bit about in just a second. But again, as we track our own numbers, we're seeing just incrementally huge increases on this. And that is a reflection of us doing our own documentation and reclaiming it for ourselves. So this report, when we put this out in February of earlier this year, it was really important to us to have a report that high pointed and highlighted some of the issues that we're seeing here in Alaska. And I can put the report in the chat, but it's on our website. But it's an overview of the issue here for Alaska in the audience. And the intention of this first report was really for our people to be equipped with saying, hey, this is what's happening and this is what we're experiencing. And these are the numbers that we know and that we have. We were very intentionally deliberate about how we released the report. So the report first went to tribes. It was a tiered release so that tribes were able to have the information first and we could respond to their questions first and foremost. And then we released it to frontline advocacy groups, such as some of the people in the working group, people who are doing work on the front lines day in and day out for advocacy. And then after that, we released it publicly and published it on our website, which again, we can put in the chat for you to look at. But this report was the first Alaska specific one. We continue to home and update the database. And I can answer questions about that. Some of the questions that we get, for example, is like, okay, well, what is the time period of the data that you have? And although that seems like a really easy question, again, because systems in the state and law enforcement agencies, and really no one has been accountable or responsible for homing and tracking the data, it's actually really hard to answer that question. So in our database at Data for Indigenous Justice, 2 of the cases that I have were given to me by an elder from the 60s. So an elder said, I remember this happening in my community. These are the names. And I remember no one talking about it. And so I have names, 2 names from as far back as the 60s, but it doesn't mean I have continuous data from the 60s. And then people ask, well, what about regionally? Regionally is also what sounds easy. We can pull by the location of the incidents and the cases, but that's only reflective oftentimes of where law enforcement filed the reports and the cases, not necessarily maybe the small community which they come from. Because unfortunately, we know many incidents and cases or trafficking or homicides happen in the urban areas. So there's disproportionately a lot of reflection that if I pulled it by location and showed where those were from, you would see heavy amounts in like Fairbanks and Anchorage, for example, or hubs versus the actual communities that maybe our tribal members are from. So what seems like easy questions about the data can be really complex, again, because it hasn't, no one's been accountable to needing to track or to report on this. That's another issue. So that's where we're at today. That's the most recent report that we have for Alaska. And I can share about some of our vision and our work going forward as well for decolonizing data and what it means to have data sovereignty. So as we do this work to home and steward the data, we collect it and we keep track of it, but we don't just sit with it to have it, right, and to report out. We immediately use the information to advocate and say, these are patterns we're seeing across families, and this is what they're telling us, and this is where we need systems change. So being intimately engaged with the data day in and day out means that I carry a lot of the stories from our people in our communities that I'm able to see across the information, like, hey, we keep having issues with jurisdiction, for example, or hey, we keep hearing that there's a delay in prosecution, right? And so homing and stewarding the data isn't just collecting the numbers and the names, but it's hearing the stories that in the lived experiences from our people and then seeing patterns so that we can advocate for change. So that's one of the things that we do is we have the data and we turn around and we say, this is a gap that we're seeing in the system that needs to be filled. The other thing that we do is specifically create and advocate for those specific data systems, such as the ones at APD and the state troopers or healthcare systems to better capture us. So not only do we say, hey, this is the story of the lives of our people and this is what we know, but also these are the ways that systems can better serve us on a data level. So this is where I kind of nerd out, I'll be honest. This is where like I write recommendations, for example, with APD about data logic branching. How can we put in tribes, or how can we have it not be collapsed data? What does it look like to better capture sex and gender? There's so many other ways that that data systems part I super nerd out on. And I can share more about that if that's something that interests you. For example, like next month, we're having some data forums on sex and gender to see how we can better capture folks who might identify as trans or LGBTQ folks and things like that. So the work that we do is so multifaceted where people might just say, oh, you track, but there's so much more to it. And the ways that we are able to then transform that into meaningful change in our communities. So again, I can answer questions if there's very specific pieces you're interested in, or you want to learn more about our community engagement and pieces like that. I'm happy to answer questions. I wanted to kind of high point the information so that you knew a little bit about our work and what we're doing. And the working group and others in the state who are doing it. And then I'm happy to answer questions about that. So Koyana, and I'm gonna stop sharing screen, but I can go back and share some of it. I went through it pretty briefly, but it's again, because each of those slides could be a whole presentation in itself. But again, Koyana for having me, and I see a couple things coming up in the chat, so I'm going to stop sharing screen, and I would love to have this more like a discussion and be able to answer what's most helpful for you all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Apak, for being here today, and to you and your colleagues for this really important and hard work. So we're going to go ahead and open it up to questions now. And one of the first questions that we have has to do with the data structures. This person is saying they'd like to hear more.
Yeah, so I can give an example of specifically, again, working with APD. This was also great timing. So not only were we meeting with them as community members and saying this is an issue, but also their data systems were super out of date, like from the 90s, which we all know technology from the 90s is ancient. That's ancient ways. And so they're in the process of getting a new vendor for data structures. And so this is an opportunity to have the data system set up in a way that actually serve our community members, including our Alaska Native people, but all members of our community. So the data structures, for example, like that 4-category box, this is the time where we can set it up and say, hey, this isn't working for us and what's going to work better. So how can we expand race and ethnicity boxes that better capture us? One of them that is a quote easy gimme is to not collapse multi-heritage into just one. We lose all, that loses in identifying factors for not just us as Indigenous peoples, but for all other race and ethnicities. The other point that I think is important to note, right, is that we aren't talking about just race and ethnicity we do that because we know that there's political weight and historical experiences of those identifiers. And so we go through those nuances because it impacts us politically, right? And so the data structures, for example, there's recommendations to have them not be collapsed. You can also do logic models where you say, if someone clicks Alaska Native, for example, then it would queue a drop down of selecting regionally is an example. You can also have all of the tribes listed that they're affiliated with. And again, each of these words are being very specifically chosen. Tribal affiliation is different than enrollment, right? So we know these kinds of nuances matter. But some of the things I let people know is like, we think, oh, well, there's so many tribes here in Alaska. That seems like so hard, but we have scholarship entities all the time who have drop downs and where we select our tribal affiliation all the time. So it's very doable, right? So we have things that we can point to that work and that serve us better. So that's a little bit about the data structures. The next area of growth that I'm hoping to do a better job, both for data for Indigenous justice and for advocacy and structures and systems, is around sex and gender. We don't live in a binary world. And again, how can data systems better serve us? So that's the next area of growth that we'll be kind of deep diving into as an organization in partnership with lots of orgs next month. So
thank you so much. We have another question here. Do you also look at potential for restoring men's role in protecting women?
Yes, thank you so much, Josephine, for that question. I have a background in gender and sexuality studies. So this has been, even before I went to school, I volunteered and worked at a domestic violence and sexual assault shelter in Washington. And much of the work and scholarship that I have been able to do through academia was based around gender-based violence. And early on, even when I was doing my undergraduate project, they're always strength-based, knowing that culture is the foundation of our wellness and that we have the solutions to these issues in our cultures. But early on, I knew that, we can work in domestic violence and sexual assault until the day we die, but unless we start hearing from our men, we aren't going to get anywhere, right? And so having the men's voices are so important and their roles restored in protecting women, as you're saying. I recently finished my PhD just earlier this year, and my dissertation was with Alaska Native men, particularly about what it means to be healthy men in their community. And so that's something that I was really fortunate to listen and hear with men. And I can share that if no one likes to read dissertations. But yes, I definitely acknowledge that. The other thing on the data side is people often ask if I'm homing the rates of violence that men face. And so in our database, I do pull data for our Alaska Native men as well. But I haven't reported on that yet because I think there needs to be a lot of narrative building and work around the differences of violence that Alaska Native men face versus the reason we see disproportionate rates of violence for Indigenous women. And that nuance of difference, I think, is really important because oftentimes when people ask about the high rates for men, it's in an effort to override the conversation of femme-identifying people. And so I think as we grow into that discussion with men, then I think that there will be a time where we are ready to put that information out there in a way that's meaningful and good without overriding the current experiences that are faced disproportionately by femme identifying people. So that was a lot, both from dissertation talk to data, but I hope that answered the question.
Thank you so much. And I have to say there are several comments from people on here that are saying they really want to read your dissertation. So if that's available publicly, I don't know if you have the link.
UAF live streamed my defense on Facebook, which, you know, when they asked me, they're like, can we live stream? And I was like, you know, at this point, why not? So it is very public, and we can find that link.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is, can you explain some of the trials you have had working with law enforcement to get this information? And are there any notable successes with law enforcement agencies that are partnering well with you on your goals and objectives?
Yeah, thank you so much. So it definitely differs across the state, you know, which is for a lot of reasons, right? So one is we have different kinds of law enforcement agencies, right? So we have police departments, we have VPSOs, and we have state troopers, which gets into the messiness of jurisdiction. If you're a policy person, the messiness of being a PL 280 state. And there's so much there. Some successes. Well, I guess I'll answer some of the challenges first. So it is really hard to work sometimes with law enforcement agencies because when the answers or the questions emerge, it means that oftentimes the lack of accountability that has happened thus far becomes visible, right? And so when I met with APD, for example, if they were going to answer my many endless questions about data and what was happening, it meant that they were going to have to take responsibility for it not already happening, right? Inherently, that sets up a system of accountability. And I applaud APD for answering my many questions, and they continue to meet with me and talk about this. And I think that that's a really good success. Is that the case for every police department in the state? Absolutely not. So we know that Nome Police Department, for example, is literally being sued over issues of this and addressing sexual assault and what's happening in that community, right? So it looks very different across the state, but I do think that we have some examples and some successes of working with law enforcement that we can learn from. The other thing I want to share is that I sit on the working group that was formed from Operation Lady Justice. So we have a coordinator here in Alaska that's a federally appointed person. And they run a working group that brings law enforcement from across the state together. And we meet every other week. And so that's another space that I'm fortunate to be in, to have those outlets of communication for different law enforcement agencies.
Thank you. We have another question. It's, what software are you using to manage the data being reclaimed?
Yeah, this is a good question. So when I first did this, I met with Sovereign Bodies Institute before I incorporated, and I asked Anita over there, I said, hey, what are you doing over there, and what software do you use? And then I consulted with some data analysts who work in big data sets and described kind of what I would be doing. And originally it was good old paper and pen. And right now it's simply in an Excel Word document, because where we're at with, you know, line items of less than 1,000, you know, I'm at maybe around maybe 1,000 line items is what I'm working in. That's pretty manageable for Excel right now. But I have consulted with other data analysts that have temporarily and tried out putting the same database in, was it OneNote? And so I have a kind of a draft one if I wanted to shift platforms. But right now, Excel is the best because I pull from different, I get it in different formats. So sometimes I get it in Excel, sometimes I get it in PDF, sometimes I get it in different formats. Excel is the one that's able to merge them most compatibly, although it's still a lot of manual work to do that. So right now it is just an Excel spreadsheet, nothing too fancy.
Great, thank you. We don't have any additional questions. Is there anything else that you would like to share that were, that may have been sparked by questions or that we didn't cover? We'll give folks just a second to type stuff into the Q&A in the case they have additional questions, and we'll wait just a few more minutes and we'll start winding down our presentation.
Yeah, I think in the chat, there is a question, Diane, I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly. Diane asked something about the variety of data sets and databases involved, the platform, coordination between multiple data management groups, and interested in to understand what that looks like as coordination between different owners of data and data sets. So for example, some of the merging that I did recently, I think I had 5 different things I had to merge. And some of them, for example, was a 10-year pull from the state troopers, right? And so that one, they gave to me in a PDF. So that one is a manual line by line, one that I do, but that owner of it, right? Because technically that information through the Freedom of Information Act should be publicly available, but isn't made available. That's why I do those requests. And so then it is owned technically by the public, right? And then I just request it and do it because they aren't putting it out freely. And then some of the names in it, for example, like when we put out this report in February of 2021, it was a long discussion with my board about, do we put out the names? And of course, some of the pros of putting out the names is that then if there's tips or people have information about some of the cases, they have the names available. But then some of course, the concerns are the protections of the families who have shared that, and do they want that put out? And so we have to navigate that really carefully, and I definitely veer on the more protective side of privacy for families because it's such a hard topic. And then I do have working memorandums of agreement. Right now, there's a certain region that is interested in sharing their data, and we've had really good conversations about how it's used in my work specifically and what they would need to feel comfortable in sharing it. And so we're collaborating on sharing an MOU, for example. So it looks like different things depending on the source of the data.
Thank you. We just had a few questions start coming in, some additional questions. Are there any asks you have for opportunities to support or connect to this effort?
Yes. So oftentimes going back to that working group of the 6 organizations, we have events and actions throughout the year, and roughly I can tell you what 2022 will look like. So early in the years, we usually like to start with an update on the work so people know and we're disseminating what we're doing and getting feedback. So often we'll start the year with lunch and learns. We also have a legislative plan being put forward so that when January comes, we want to be able to say these are the bills that we support and encourage support on. So you can look out for that in the next coming months as we round into 2022. And then, raising awareness is really important too, and being an ally in whatever capacity you are in. So we recently wrapped up a 5K just in September. Yeah, September. And that's always really popular. And that's a good time to advocate and use visibility and social media to engage. It's also a healing event. So we have things like vigils. We've had things like lunch and learns, webinars, data trainings. We've done action items. One of the ways that we reclaimed data early on in one of our first years was that we used social media to flood the FOIA system because we weren't getting the information from the state. And so then we had tribes and individuals and orgs file over 40 requests to reclaim the information. So there's lots of different actions we can take. And there's lots of ways that you can be involved by participating in the events and tuning into what we have coming up for legislative season and lunch and learns in January.
Thank you. If you eventually have more robust tribal affiliation and location data, what are some new forms of advocacy and action that could open up?
Yes, goals. You were seeing the vision. Definitely. So there are ways that I would love to support tribes in continuing to self-determine what their needs are on this issue. It's going to look different for our communities, depending on where they're at and what they need. We know that. And my goal would be to be able to give the information to our tribes so that they can self-determine what they need in their community. Maybe it's prevention, or maybe it's case management, or maybe it's more investigations. Maybe it's more effort on trafficking. That's for our tribes to decide. And my role, I feel like in data, is to equip us with the information we need to do that. So I would love to be able to be a good resource to our tribes and continue to advocate for what we need. One of the really big things that we've asked for, one of the continuous asks that you'll see, is we really want tribal public safety funding that's a non-competitive renewal resource for our tribes. We don't even have basic, general funding year to year for our tribes to operate public safety programs. They have to do all of these, programs and competitive grants. So there's some really big pie in the sky asks like that, that I would love to see and that we work for. So again, there's so many things, but that's kind of the biggie. And it's how I see data specifically supporting our self-determination on this front.
Thank you. Are there other specific data systems that you think may need changing to reflect Indigenous identities more fairly? So specifically, systems where obscuring Indigenous identity has an impact on communities.
Yeah, so oftentimes, again, I shared some of the local efforts, but one of the things that I've been working on with more like national partners, and especially as we have things like Savannah's Act and things like that, what are some of the shared things we can do across tribes in the United States that will serve all of us? And one of those things is that I offer up as, quote, low-hanging fruit, and at least would be a tangible starting point. We arrived at these data systems because we inherited them from systems that weren't meant to serve us. This came from the US Census trying to eliminate Indigenous peoples. That's why we're here today. So in order to fix that, one of the ways that we can do, a low-hanging fruit, again, I don't think it's the best solution, but it's a starting point, would be to update data systems from the most recent census. So that effort had a lot of tribal input where we were trying to be better captured in that data system. And so one of the ways that we can do that is use the census data structure and move it from federal to state to local, because that's how it happened anyhow. Right. So if we can update it at least to the census that was most recently done, it's a tangible starting point that is shared across tribes. So it's just an idea, just one idea, but there's so many more.
Okay, one last question on our list here. You've answered several, so thank you so much.
Yeah, no, I love answering the questions because I think people have, yeah, this is where it's a better use of our time.
What do you wish you had known going into your PhD program? And what do you think that you should know if they're interested in this field or work and study area?
Yeah, I love being able to share about the experience of going through higher education. Um, one of the things that I made sure I personally had in place, and it wasn't perfect, right? But was really knowing my own healing routines and wellness routines. So making sure I had patterns of being physically active, eating well. I had a good support system in place to go into a PhD program because it is really, really hard. But making sure like you have these patterns in place to get you through. Of course there's going to be lows and things like that, but if you identify, what do you do to cope well? Is it journaling, or is it getting out on the land, and knowing how you're going to stay well through the program, then you're setting yourself up to succeed. And so that's my biggest thing. Of course it was still really intense, but having that circle of support, it really takes a community to get people through these programs. But I think we stand ready to support you and others.
Thank you. And thank you so much for your time today. I know you were so busy, you ran from one presentation directly to this one. And it's because this topic is so important. And in the chat, Colleen Reynolds left you a comment. She said, "You're the voice for many." And that is so true. So thank you so much for doing that for so many people out there that really need to have a light shined on this issue. And I'd also like to thank all of our attendees today. We really appreciate you joining us. We ask you to keep an eye out for upcoming Shine a Light presentations at nwc.uaf.edu or on Facebook at facebook.com/uaf.nwc. If you'd like to share the recording or give feedback, you can do so by visiting the Courses tab on the Northwest Campus's website. And again, thank you so much for being here and have a fantastic rest of your day.
Diana, thank you so much.
Thank you.